My daughter-in-law called me a burden with a checkbook once. She didn't know I was standing in the hallway. I just kept walking to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table I'd bought in 1987. I remember thinking, she's not entirely wrong about the checkbook part. Then I thought about what I was going to do about it. That was 3 months before everything changed, before I made one phone call that started a chain reaction neither of them saw coming, before my son learned that 30 years of fatherhood doesn't obligate me to finance his wife's contempt indefinitely. My name is Edmund Carey. I'm 69 years old. I spent 34 years as a licensed civil engineer, mostly infrastructure work, bridges, drainage systems, flood control projects across the Southeast. I retired in 2019 with a pension, a solid 401k, and 2 paid-off properties in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm not rich by any stretch, but I'm comfortable. I worked hard, saved carefully, and made smart decisions for a long time. The one decision I didn't make smart was letting my son and his wife move into my house. My son's name is Philip. He's 36 now. I'll be honest with you. He was a good kid. Not the kind of good that gets straight A's and earns scholarships, but the genuine kind. Thoughtful. He'd notice when you were tired. He'd remember your favorite things. His mother used to say he had a big heart, and she was right. She died when he was 22, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to funeral. I held that boy through it. We held each other. He met Vanessa 18 months after his mother passed. I think grief made him vulnerable to a certain kind of person, the kind who looks like stability but is actually looking for a foundation to stand on while they build something for themselves. Vanessa was attractive, sharp, and socially fluent in a way that reads as warmth until you've known her long enough to notice the pattern. She could walk into a room and immediately understand who had the most influence. She had opinions about everything and delivered them like helpful observations. She told Philip within the first year of dating that his apartment was not a place serious people live, which led to them moving into a nicer unit that he couldn't really afford. They married 4 years ago. I flew to Savannah for the wedding, sat in the front row, and gave a toast I meant sincerely. I wanted it to work. I wanted my son to be happy. 6 months after the wedding, the first ask came. Philip called on a Tuesday evening, voice careful the way it gets when he's been coached on what to say. He and Vanessa were dealing with some financial pressure. Her car needed replacing. His student loans were adjustable rate and had jumped. They were looking at options. Could they possibly stay with me for a few months? Just until they stabilized. I had a 4-bedroom house in Asheville. I was living alone. I said yes. That was 3 years ago. 3 years, 4 months, and approximately 11 days by the time this is over. The first year wasn't bad. Philip and I fell back into an easy rhythm. He helped around the yard. We'd eat dinner together most nights. Vanessa was working remote as a marketing coordinator, and mostly stayed in the room they'd claimed as an office. She was polite enough at the start. Surface-level polite. The kind where everything is fine, as long as you don't require anything real. By year 2, the surface had worn through in places. She started leaving dishes in the sink, specifically after I'd just cleaned the kitchen. I don't know if it was intentional or just carelessness, but it happened consistently enough that I started to wonder. She referred to my friends as your old crowd, with a tone that made it sound like a diagnosis. She told Philip in a voice loud enough for me to hear through one door that I hovered and that it was affecting her ability to work from home. I was in my own home. I hadn't spoken to her before noon in 2 weeks. Philip never said anything directly. He'd get a look on his face when she made comments, not disagreement, just discomfort, and then he'd move on to something else. I told myself he was managing a difficult situation. I gave him credit he may not have deserved. The money part was always there, but rarely spoken about directly. Philip made decent money managing a regional distribution center, maybe $58,000 a year. Vanessa's remote position paid around $42,000. That's $100,000 combined, which is not nothing. But they had Philip's student loans, her car payment on a new SUV, credit cards that I only learned about gradually, and a lifestyle budget that didn't match their income. None of it touched the rent, utilities, or groceries at my house. I calculated once, quietly, on paper I kept in my workshop in the garage. 3 years at fair market rent for a room in Asheville. Not the whole house, just a room. Runs about $1,400 a month. Utilities average $300. Groceries. I bought for the household. Another $400 monthly, because Vanessa ate organic and I was trying to keep the peace. That's $2,500 a month. $30,000 a year. Over 3 years, $90,000. Conservatively, they thanked me at Christmas. Generic card, pre-printed sentiment, Vanessa's handwriting. That was the extent of the accounting. The moment I refer to as the turn happened on a Thursday evening in late September. I'd met a woman named Agnes at my church's Thursday night social. Agnes was 64, recently retired from hospital administration, with a dry sense of humor and genuine opinions about things that mattered. We had coffee twice, then dinner once, and by the time I mentioned her at home, we'd known each other for 2 months. Philip seemed pleased when I told him. He said that was really good, Dad, and he meant it. Vanessa's reaction was different. She looked up from her laptop and said, "Where would you even take someone at your age? You can barely drive at night." I do not have trouble driving at night. I passed my last vision test 18 months ago. I let it go. The following Saturday, I invited Agnes over for coffee. Simple. Afternoon, nothing elaborate. I told Philip and Vanessa at breakfast. Vanessa put down her fork. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said. I asked her to explain what she meant. She said she wasn't comfortable having strangers in the house, that she worked from home and needed a certain environment, that she hadn't agreed to having guests. I told her this was my house. She said, "It's been our home for 3 years, Edmund." Not Dad, Edmund. She'd never called me Dad, which I had stopped hoping for long ago. But she'd at least used you, like I was present. Edmund landed differently. Formal. Like addressing a landlord she was about to file a complaint against. Philip looked at the table. I asked him directly what he thought. He said maybe it was better to give everyone some time to adjust, which was not an answer, but was also, in its own way, completely an answer. I told them I'd think about it. I went to my workshop. I sat in there for an hour among my tools and the half-built birdhouse I'd been working on for my back porch. Then I picked up my phone and texted Agnes and told her I'd like to reschedule for somewhere nicer, my treat. That night at 11:43, I got a text from Philip's number. "Dad, Vanessa needs this space to work and decompress. You bringing women around is disrespectful to our home. Either respect that, or we need to have a different conversation about the living situation." I read it twice. Then I read it twice. Then I read it the third time. I set the phone face down on the workbench. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage, though there was some of that underneath. It was something quieter and more clarifying. It was the feeling of something settling into place that had been uncertain for a long time. A decision I'd been putting off because I kept hoping the situation would correct itself had finally made itself obvious. I picked the phone back up. I looked at the text again. Either respect that, or we need to have a different conversation about the living situation. My son, in my house, using my roof and my utilities and my groceries, was telling me to change my behavior or face consequences. I put the phone in my pocket and went back inside. I passed their closed bedroom door and went to my own room and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't anxious. I was thinking. In the morning, I made coffee before they were up and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I wrote down 3 columns, what I owned, what they had contributed, and what I was willing to do next. By the time I heard movement from their room, I'd filled 2 pages. Before continuing, I want to say something to anyone watching this who's been in a version of this situation. You are not obligated to explain your patience while someone mistakes it for permission. You are not required to justify your kindness to the people who have been spending it. I've been patient for 3 years. I was done explaining it. I had a meeting that afternoon with my attorney, a man named Carl Whitmore, who I'd worked with on property transactions for 12 years. Carl had done my will, my trust documents, helped me transfer the deed on my second property to a rental management structure. He knew my financial situation in detail. When I called his assistant that morning and said I needed a meeting today, she found me a slot at 2 o'clock. Carl's office was in a converted Victorian on Marymount Avenue. He met me in his conference room, looked at my face, and said, "Tell me what happened." I told him. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about Carl. When I finished, he sat back. He said, "What outcome are you looking for?" I said I wanted them out of my house on a defined timeline, legally clean, with no ambiguity about my rights. And I wanted to do it in a way that was airtight, because Vanessa was the kind of person who would look for angles. Carl said, "North Carolina doesn't require much. They've never paid rent, which actually helps you. No lease means no tenant protections under landlord-tenant law. You'll issue a written notice. I'd recommend 30 days, requiring them to vacate. If they don't comply, you file for summary ejectment in small claims court. It's simple, it's fast, and you will win." I said, "Draft the notice. I want it ready to deliver by the end of the week." Carl made a note. Then he paused. "There's something else you're not telling me." I laid out the financial piece. 2 years earlier, Philip had asked me to co-sign a personal loan, $35,000 for what he called the home improvement project. There was no home improvement. The money went to pay off Vanessa's credit cards. I knew this because I'd seen the statements by accident and hadn't said anything because saying something would have required a confrontation I wasn't ready for yet. I'd co-signed in good faith. Now I was done acting in good faith toward people who'd used it against me. Carl walked me through the co-signer withdrawal process. Under North Carolina law, requesting removal from a co-signer agreement is possible under documented change of circumstances. Estrangement, which was now effectively what we had, qualifies. The bank would reassess the loan without my income and creditworthiness backing it. Philip's debt-to-income ratio, without my support, would not meet their threshold. The loan would come due in full or face collection. I signed the preliminary documentation that afternoon. I drove home through the October mountains, the leaves just starting to turn, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly. Purpose. They were in the living room when I got back. Vanessa on the couch with her laptop, Philip watching something on his tablet. Normal evening. I said hello, went to the kitchen, made dinner for myself. Nothing was said about the previous night's text. Nothing was ever going to be said about it from their side, because accountability requires self-awareness, and self-awareness requires the ability to see yourself clearly. Carl's courier delivered the notice on Friday at noon. Certified mail, hand-delivered, signature required. I was having lunch with Agnes at a bistro on Lexington Avenue when my phone started ringing. Philip, then Vanessa, then Philip again. 7 calls in 20 minutes. Agnes looked at my phone on the table and then at me. I said, "My son just received a certified letter from my attorney." She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Hungry, actually. This soup is excellent." I answered on the 8th call. Philip's voice was somewhere between confused and panicked. He kept saying, "Dad, what is this? What is this?" And I told him it was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the property, and that I hoped he and Vanessa would use the time to make a workable plan. He said, "You can't do this. This is our home." I said, "Philip, your name is not on the deed, the mortgage, the utility accounts, or the insurance policy. You've lived here for 3 years without paying rent, utilities, or contributing to groceries. The only thing making this feel like your home is the fact that I've allowed it to. That's changing." He put Vanessa on the phone. Her approach was different. Lower, more controlled. The voice she used when she was managing a situation. She said, "Edmund, this is completely inappropriate. You're doing this because I asked for basic boundaries around my workspace." I said, "No, Vanessa. I'm doing this because your husband sent me a text message in my own home telling me to change my behavior or face consequences. I took him up on it. I'm facing consequences in the opposite direction." She started to say something about lawyers, about harassment, about involving her family. I told her she was welcome to consult anyone she liked and that Carl Whitmore's number was on the letterhead. I hung up and finished my soup. The next 2 weeks moved with the quiet inevitability of something that's been set in motion properly. I started moving my personal items to the guest room so the process would be simpler when it was time. I arranged a rental through a property management contact, a clean 2-bedroom apartment in Weaverville, about 15 minutes north, $950 a month. Enough space, reasonable commute, nothing fancy, exactly what I needed. Vanessa tried 3 separate approaches in those 2 weeks. First was the emotional appeal. Philip showing up at my workshop door looking exhausted, saying they were scared, saying they didn't have enough saved for first, last, and deposit. I told him 30 years of free rent for me should have been sufficient runway to save a deposit, and that perhaps reviewing their monthly expenses would be instructive. Second was the negotiation. Vanessa sitting across from me at the kitchen table one morning with a printed spreadsheet, offering to start paying rent going forward, $700 a month, as a gesture of goodwill. I told her that fair market rent for this property was $2,200 a month, and that I wasn't interested in continued tenancy at any rate. Third was the threat. A letter from a family law attorney, 2 paragraphs, suggesting that my actions constituted constructive eviction and that they were documenting everything for potential elder financial abuse claims. I forwarded it to Carl. He called me back within an hour, laughing lightly, and said, "They have no case. Constructive eviction requires that the landlord makes living conditions uninhabitable. You've offered them 30 days' notice and market rate rental terms they declined. Elder financial abuse requires that someone exploited you financially. What they've described is the opposite of exploitation." He sent a response letter the same day. I never heard from their attorney again. The bank moved faster than I expected. Philip called me 12 days into the 30-day period, voice stripped of the coached quality it usually had, something rawer underneath. He said, "Dad, I got a letter from Community First Bank. They're saying my loan is being reviewed because the cosigner withdrew. They want the balance paid within 45 days, or they're sending it to collections." I said, "Yes, that's accurate." He said, "The balance is $32,000. I said, "I know." Long pause. Then, "How are we supposed to pay $32,000? I said. "I've been wondering the same thing about the $90,000 you've cost me over the last 3 years. We can call it an offset if you'd like." He didn't have an answer for that. That's the thing about numbers laid flat on a table. They don't respond to tone of voice. I moved out of the main house and into the Weaverville apartment on a Wednesday, which felt appropriately midweek. Unheroic, practical. I loaded my truck with 3 trips. The last thing I took was a wooden toolbox my father gave me, which had lived on my workshop shelf for 40 years. Carrying it out felt like the punctuation on something. The apartment was small and it was mine. I could leave a book on the kitchen table and it would still be there the next morning. I could have Agnes over without consulting anyone. I could wake up at 5:30 and make coffee loud because I'm an early riser and I shouldn't have to apologize for that in my own kitchen. I slept 9 hours the first night. I hadn't slept that well in 2 years. The 30-day deadline passed on a Tuesday. They hadn't paid, hadn't vacated, hadn't made any genuine attempt to do either. Carl filed for summary ejectment in Buncombe County District Court. Hearing date was set for 3 weeks out. I attended with Carl. They attended with the family law attorney, a harried-looking man in his 40s, who clearly understood on some level that his clients had a weak position. The judge was direct. She reviewed the documents Carl presented: deed, utility records, the certified notice, the signed delivery receipt, the complete absence of any payment history. She asked Philip and Vanessa if they disputed that I owned the property. They did not. She asked if they disputed receiving the 30-day notice. They did not. She asked if they had paid any rent or attempted to negotiate payment terms in good faith. Their attorney said they'd attempted to negotiate, and Carl provided documentation showing that the offer had been $700 against a fair market rate of $2,200. The judge said, "That's not good faith negotiation. That's a number chosen to be declined." She ruled in my favor. 14 days to vacate. Sheriff's enforcement if they failed to comply. Vanessa cried in the hallway outside the courtroom. Real tears, I think, which surprised me slightly. I don't think she genuinely believed it would get this far. People who rely on other people's reluctance to act are always surprised when the act finally comes. Philip looked at me in the hallway. Not angry, not sad exactly. He looked the way someone looks when they've been holding a story in their head and the evidence has just made that story untenable. He said, "I didn't think you'd actually do it." I said, "I know, that was the problem. I didn't say it cruelly. I meant it as plainly as it sounded. They were out in 12 days. Left the keys in the mailbox. Carl's property inspector went through and documented the condition. A significant stain on the guest room carpet, a cracked window pane in the office they'd used, some scuffed baseboards. Minor damage overall. Nothing that couldn't be addressed before I listed the house. I submitted an insurance claim for the carpet and the window. Both were covered. I listed the house 6 weeks later through a realtor I'd worked with before. Asking price was $380,000. We received 2 offers within the first week. I accepted the stronger, $130,75,000. Cash buyers, a couple relocating from Charlotte who wanted to be in Asheville before the new year. We closed in 23 days. After the remaining mortgage balance and closing costs, I walked away with $240,000 that went directly into a conservative investment account. I was living in an apartment that cost me $950 a month. I had 2 rental properties generating combined income of $2,200 a month. I had my pension and a 401k I hadn't touched. I had Agnes, who thought the whole situation was handled with exactly the right amount of patience, followed by exactly the right amount of decisiveness. For the first month after everything settled, I kept waiting to feel guilty. I'd been told my whole life that family was unconditional, that you support your children, that whatever problems exist, you work through them because blood is permanent. The guilt never came. What came instead was a clarity I didn't expect. The recognition that unconditional love does not mean unconditional subsidizing, that the difference between a parent and an ATM is the ability to say no, and that saying no is not abandonment. It's the thing that makes the relationship honest. Philip contacted me through email about 6 weeks after the court date. Not a long message. He said he and Vanessa had found an apartment in Arden, 2-bedroom, $1,200 a month. He said he'd been talking to someone, a therapist. He didn't use that word, but I inferred it. About some things. He said he knew he owed me more than an email, and he wasn't ready to say everything yet, but he wanted me to know he didn't blame me. I read that line 3 times. I don't blame you. Not an apology. Not an acknowledgement of what he'd sent me that night. The text that had made the decision simple, but not a continuation of the siege either. A white flag of sorts, or maybe just an opening. I wrote back 2 sentences. I'm glad you have a place. Take care of yourself. I didn't open the door all the way, but I didn't close it. Vanessa started an Instagram series about navigating toxic in-law dynamics and setting limits with controlling family members. Several mutual acquaintances mentioned it to me, either because they thought I should know or because they were curious how I'd react. I looked at it once, closed the app, and moved on with my afternoon. She was working with what she had. I had court documents. There's only one of those that matters to anyone who matters. Agnes and I started taking long weekends. We drove to the Outer Banks in November, 2 days of cold wind and empty beaches. We went to Chattanooga in December for the Christmas market. In January, we booked a trip to Sedona because neither of us had been, and we were both tired of waiting to do things we'd been putting off. In February, Philip called on a Sunday evening. I answered on the second ring. He sounded different, quieter, more deliberate, less scripted. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he'd gone back through years in his mind and seen things differently than he had while he was living them. He said the therapist had asked him why he'd sent me that text, and he'd realized he hadn't asked himself that question at all. He'd just sent it because Vanessa was upset, and because making Vanessa not upset had become the central organizing principle of his life for 4 years. He said, "I'm working on that." I said I was glad to hear it. He said, "Can we have lunch sometime? Not to relitigate anything, just have lunch." I said yes. Not yet, but yes. He said that was fair. It was fair. Some bridges don't burn. They need reconstruction on different terms, with better materials, and you don't begin that process until both sides are ready to build with something more durable than the other person's obligation. In March, I found a small craftsman house in North Asheville with a detached workshop space in the back. I'd been building birdhouses and small furniture pieces as a hobby for years, always in inadequate space. This workshop had real square footage, a dust collection system already installed, windows on 3 walls. I bought the house the same week I saw it, standing in that workshop the first afternoon, with the late winter light coming through the west-facing windows and nothing but space and tools and time. I thought about Philip at 8 years old bringing me a birdhouse he'd made in school, lopsided, painted orange for some reason, one wall slightly shorter than the other. I put it in the backyard and hung a wreath on it at Christmas for 3 years because it was his and he'd made it. I still have it, in a box in my storage unit. I'll probably put it up in the new workshop when everything is settled. That's not a resolution. It's just a fact I'm sitting with. Some things you hold on to not because they represent what happened, but because they represent what was possible before things went sideways. The birdhouse was before Vanessa. It was before the text message, before the attorney's letters, before the courtroom, before the 14 days to vacate. Before all of it, there was a kid who made something with his hands and wanted to show his father. I don't know yet what Philip is becoming. I know what he was, and I know what he became for a while, and I know that the space between those two things is where the real story is still being written. What I know for certain is what I am. I'm a 69-year-old man who spent 34 years building things that last, who spent 3 years letting someone else's contempt live in his house and convincing himself that patience had no limits, who finally understood that the most loving thing he could do for his son, for himself, for anyone, was to stop making it comfortable to treat him badly. I'm also a man who spent last Saturday morning in a well-lit workshop building a cedar planter box for Agnes's back porch, while she read on the other side of the window and brought me coffee at 10 o'clock without being asked. A man who drives without difficulty at night. A man who goes to bed when he wants and wakes up when he wants and doesn't apologize for existing in his own space. That's not a small thing. After 3 years, it felt enormous. If any part of this story sounds familiar, I want you to know something. The moment you decide your dignity is non-negotiable is not a cruel moment. It's not a selfish moment. It is, often, the most loving thing you can do, because it demands that the people around you rise to meet you, rather than letting them settle into the comfort of your unconditional generosity. Some people will rise. Some won't. Either way, you will know you did the honest thing. That's enough. For me, that's exactly enough. If this story spoke to you, please like this video and subscribe to Deep Revenge Stories. Drop a comment telling me what time it is where you're watching from right now. I read every single one. And if you have a story of your own, I'd like to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful thing is just knowing someone else has been there too. I've thought a lot about the word burden since all of this happened. Vanessa used it like she was stating a fact. A burden with a checkbook, set in the hallway of my own house while I was 20 feet away. And the strange thing is, she wasn't entirely wrong about one part of it. I had been carrying something, just not what she meant. What I'd been carrying was the accumulated weight of 3 years of my own silence. 3 years of walking past the dishes in the sink, past the passive comments, past my son's averted eyes when his wife said something that should have been said back to her. I told myself I was being patient. What I was actually doing was making it easy for people to keep going. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about family loyalty. We treat endurance like it's the same thing as love. We act like the longer you absorb someone's contempt without reacting, the more you must care. But I've come to believe the opposite is closer to the truth. When you allow someone to treat you badly without consequence, you're not protecting the relationship. You're slowly teaching them that the relationship has no floor, that there is no point at which your dignity becomes non-negotiable. Edmund's mistake, my mistake, wasn't letting Philip and Vanessa move in. Life is complicated. People need help sometimes, and that's real. The mistake was letting the temporary become permanent without anyone naming it, and then letting the entitlement grow in the silence I kept providing. What changed things wasn't the text message itself, though that was the moment I stopped deliberating. What changed things was what I did in the hours afterward. I didn't react with anger. I didn't have a confrontation at midnight. I sat in my workshop. I thought clearly, and I made a decision based not on emotion, but on principle. That's what I mean when I talk about the difference between patience and planning. Patience without a point is just absorption. Planning is patience that finally knows where it's going. The 3 qualities that pulled me through this weren't courage in the dramatic sense. They were simpler than that. The first was honesty, being honest with myself, that what was happening in my home was not acceptable. even when accepting it was easier than addressing it. The second was precision. When I finally acted, I acted carefully, legally, deliberately, not in a way that could be undone or challenged or spun into something else. The third was restraint. I didn't destroy Philip. I withdrew. There's a significant difference, and I think the difference matters morally. I removed my support. I didn't go after him. The consequences that followed were the natural result of choices he and Vanessa had already made long before I got involved. What Vanessa never understood, and what I think Philip is only beginning to understand now, is that every relationship has a structure underneath it. When that structure is one person giving indefinitely and the other taking indefinitely, it isn't a relationship. It's a transaction with one party who doesn't know they're in one. The moment I named the structure out loud, through an attorney's letter, through a court filing, through a bank notification, the whole arrangement became visible. And visible arrangements have to be justified. Theirs couldn't be. I don't know exactly what Philip is becoming. I know what I hope for him. I hope he's learning that the people who love you most are not the ones who absorb everything without limit. They're the ones who eventually hold a mirror up and say, "This is what's actually happening here." That's a harder kind of love to receive, but it's the only kind that asks anything real of you. As for me, I wake up in my new house in North Asheville, make coffee before anyone else is awake, and go out to my workshop when the light is right. Agnes brings coffee through the window sometimes and doesn't say a word about it. That's not a small life. After everything, that feels like exactly the life I was supposed to be living all along.